Well, thank you very much. And let me just start with a disclaimer that even though I do work for JP Morgan, I'm here just speaking for myself. I don't represent the company or the company's official views. What I've been asked to do by Michael Jacobidis is to provide a little bit of a framework on what are the options and what are the issues facing Greece, and hopefully set the stage a little bit for the discussion going forward. So I want to start with a little bit of what has happened. And what has happened can really be summarized in two statistics. One has to do with the labor costs in the European Union and the divergence of those labor costs over the last 15 years. And the second has to do with the increase of the debt for a large number of countries in the European Union, driven by very low interest rates. What you see in this chart are the labor costs between 1995 and 2010 in Germany, which is the flat blue line, versus Greece, which is the green line, and Italy, which is the yellow line. So while in Germany they stayed flat, in Greece they almost doubled. And if you plot there Italy, if you plot Spain, if you plot Portugal, you see a little bit of the same situation. Right, so labor costs increased a lot, debt burden increased a lot. So what the European Union is saying, if that's the source of the problem and that's the source of the imbalance, let's try to reverse that. Let's have every government reduce the size of the public sector, and let's reduce the wages so that we get back and we reverse some of those things that have happened. What's the issue with that? There are two issues. Issue number one is, as you try to do that and as you shrink the public sector and as you reduce salaries, what obviously happens is the size of the economy shrinks, tax revenues shrink, and therefore your deficit does not necessarily shrink while unemployment goes up. The second issue is an issue of fairness. As you do this reversal, the people that are paying are not necessarily the same people that benefited during the boom years, and therefore you create a sense that this is not necessarily fair. That's why some people are advocating a different solution or a complementary solution, which is let's put our fiscal house in order, but at the same time, let's monetize some of that debt. If really a lot of these countries are illiquid but not insolvent, let's just have the ECB print a little bit of money and some or all of that problem is going to go away. I hope and I think that some combination of those two things will help us solve the crisis, but if you look in the past, a lot of times unions, monetary unions, you look at the gold standard, you look at previous efforts that Europe tried in the 70s and in the 80s didn't all work. So who knows what's going to happen? We are all hoping for the best, and we're all hoping that the European Union will continue in its present and better form. But whatever happens, none of that changes a lot of the structural changes that Greece needs to do. And with that, let me talk about Greece for the last couple of years. That's a bit of a complicated chart, but when you think about this kind of structural reform that Greece is attempting to do, you need to think of three dimensions. One dimension is what's the size of the fiscal adjustment, which is the size of the bubble. The second is what's the GDP growth that we expect the country to have, and that's the vertical axis. And the third one is what's the devaluation that the country can use as a leverage to increase competitiveness in the markets. So let me just walk there. This is what Greece is trying to do, and all of these bubbles is looking at previous structural changes that various countries have tried to do in the European Union, and also it includes Brazil and it includes Mexico in the 80s. So I think three things to notice here. One, the size of the adjustment is very high. Two, obviously Greece does not have the devaluation card to play. And three, this is all happening in an environment of an economy that's shrinking. Bottom line, this is something that was extremely hard to do to begin with. And what we've seen over the last 2 years is that all the targets that have been set ended up being too optimistic, and we are already in a situation with 18% unemployment and the structural changes that have not yet happened. So with that picture behind us, let's look at what are the things that need to happen going forward. And I separate them in three categories because when I listen to the news and I read the newspaper, everyone talks about PSI, and people don't seem to think that once this is done, we are done. For me, PSI is one of three distinct questions that can take different answers. What is Greece going to do with the debt that it already has? And that's where PSI comes in. The second is, what's the plan to stop the economy from continuing to shrink its GDP, high unemployment, and so on? And then the third is, when you think of debt restructuring and you think of the structural changes, are they better done in the euro or outside of the euro? And I'm going to talk about each one of these three things in turn. On the current path and debt restructuring, the panel has a number of experts that are going to talk about that in more detail. The only things that I'm going to say is, number one, when you look at where we are now and some of the IMF projections, they don't look great, even assuming that PSI is going to work, and that's because GDP is shrinking, right? So we need to stabilize the country, and we need to bring the debt level to a number that we think is sustainable. The second thing is we need a solution that's transparent, it's easy to understand, and brings a sense of closure. What we don't want to do is keep on going back and changing things, right? We went from no need to restructure to 21%, now to 50%. We need to make sure that whatever agreement happens, it has a sense of finality. And we need to make sure that we manage the second-order effects. So if a haircut impacts the ability of banks to lend in the market, we need to address that. If it impacts the ability of pension funds to pay retirees, we need to address that. In terms of what needs to happen, I try to categorize these things, and it's a long list. I try to categorize things in three categories. One is things that need to happen immediately to stop the depression-like statistics that we see now. The second is how do we change the public sector? And the third is what are the options for generating long-term growth for the country? Some of those things are complicated. Some of those other countries have managed to figure out. Let's start with the first one, which is tax evasion. If you look at tax rates in Greece, they are high. If you look at tax revenues, they are low. This is a problem that most of Western world, Asia, many countries have solved it. Does not depend on PSI, does not depend on foreigners. It's something that we could do on our own. Debt burden I already talked about. Recapitalization of the banks. This is not just PSI, right? It's very important for the banks to have liquidity, and it's very important for them to have a capital cushion because that's what's going to help lending in the economy. That's what's going to help grow the economy over time. In terms of the public sector, and I think these are obvious points, one is what do we want the government to do, what do we not want them to do, and let's privatize what we don't want the government to do. Second, let's get the things that the government should do into a more rational and better operation. Let's make sure we know the statistics, we know who is doing what, and we manage it in an effective way. And then number 6, instill the rule of law. Make sure that people understand there are rules and they can play with those rules and they can invest long term, which is a sense that I don't think we have to the extent that we should right now. Then long-term growth, that's a complicated one, and we have a panel to talk about that later. But I think it's about two things which I have on numbers 9 and 10, which is what are the sectors that are going to drive exports and what are the sectors that are going to have a high labor multiplier effect for the economy, which means that it's going to help generate jobs and bring unemployment down, especially in the context of a public sector that may be shrinking. And obviously all that needs to happen in a way that's agreed by major political parties so that people who invest in the country and who work in the country feel that they know what's coming. So my last point is around euro versus drachma. What I try to put there is, again, the same categories and whether it's easy, hard, or extremely hard. And there is nothing easy on the page. The argument that some people make, especially on the other side of the Atlantic for the drachma, is that if you look at Argentina, if you look at Mexico, they went back to their own currencies, they devalued those by 50%, exports boomed, and therefore they were able to make that adjustment in a much easier way than trying to adjust nominal wages. This is true, except for the fact that these countries also had a lot of commodities and they benefited from a commodity boom. In Greece's case, going outside of the euro area, apart from any political or psychological repercussions, has the impact that it has a very, very big downside. And the downside is we don't know how markets are going to react, we don't know how painful the adjustment is going to be, and we don't know how the Greek government is going to react to pressures to print money to essentially hire people and pay people in an environment which is the way it is now. And with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to go back to the panel. Thank you.